Some stories don't really fade over time. They just get sharper, more haunting. And this is definitely one of them. It's a story that stretches across 3 whole decades, starting with a really petty grudge and ending just a couple of days ago in the cold quiet of an execution room. So let's get into how it all happened.
So it all began with something so ordinary. A knock on a door, a man standing there with a bouquet of flowers. It looked like an act of kindness, but what was hiding behind those petals was something else entirely. And that door, it was more than just a door, right? It was a line. On one side, you had a family just living their lives, and on the other, a man who had planned meticulously to end every single one of them. The second that door opened, the normal world was just gone, shattered. And this is what it all led to. 4 lives just wiped out, an entire family gone. To really understand how we got to this point and what it all even means, we have to start at the very end.
Okay, so let's go to just 2 days ago, October 17th, 2025. After 30 years of legal fights and waiting, the final page of this story was finally turned at the state prison in Florence, Arizona. People who were there said Richard Djerf was just calm, almost like he wasn't really there. He didn't offer any last words, nothing. There was a brief struggle for the technicians to find a vein, and then the lethal injection started. 5 minutes later, his chest stopped moving. And that was it. He was 55 years old. Think about that. A whole lifetime had gone by since the crime was committed. And that fact, well, it hangs over every single part of this story.
But look, that final moment in the execution chamber, it doesn't really mean much unless you understand the moment that kicked this whole thing off. So we have to go back, way back to 1993. So back then, Richard Djerf was only 23. He was young, he was angry, and he was holding on to this grudge that was about to curdle into something truly, unimaginably cruel. And get this is what's so absolutely chilling. The reason for this whole nightmare, the motive, it wasn't some huge betrayal, it was a stolen stereo and a gun. Djerf was convinced his coworker, Albert Luna Jr., was to blame, and he became obsessed with a revenge that was just so horrifically out of proportion. This was not some spur-of-the-moment act of rage. No way. This was cold. It was calculated. It was like revenge as a performance, From the flower courier disguise to the knock on the door, every single step was planned out. And here's the truly devastating part. Inside that home wasn't the person he had the grudge against. It was his family. Djerf spent hours inflicting just absolute terror. He bludgeoned Albert Sr. to death. He shot Patricia and their little boy, 5-year-old Damien. He assaulted and killed their 18-year-old daughter, Rochelle. And then he tried to burn the house to the ground to cover it all up. He was caught 4 days later, and the evidence against him was just overwhelming. He even confessed to some of it. For the jurors who heard this case, there was no question, no gray area. They came up with a phrase for it that has stuck around for 30 years. Evil without confusion. But a guilty verdict, well, you'd think that would be the end. It wasn't. It was actually just the beginning of this incredibly long, painful journey through the American justice system. He was sentenced back in 1996, but for almost 3 decades, that sentence was just words on a piece of paper. You had years and years of appeals, legal challenges, and then in 2014, Arizona stopped all executions for a while. So he just sat on death row, basically a ghost in the system. A prosecutor once said that Djerf turned revenge into architecture. It's a line that just sticks with you, right? He designed his crime with such careful cruelty that the justice system felt like it had to see its own process through to the very end, no matter how long it took. So, after all the legal maneuvering, after all those years have passed, what are we really left with? We're left with the big human questions that are at the very core of this whole thing. And that's the big one, isn't it? When justice takes this long to arrive, does it even feel like justice anymore? Or does it just become something else, like a ghost from the past finally being put to rest? For the family members who had to watch him die, it wasn't some moment of victory. How could it be? They had lived through 29 holidays that felt empty, 29 years of waiting. His death wasn't a win. It was just the final punctuation mark at the end of a very, very long sentence. Because ultimately, the execution doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't wipe the slate clean. It just acts as this final, brutal reminder of what hate costs. That small grudge spread out like ink, and it stained everything and everyone it touched for generations. And that's exactly why this story can't really end with Richard Djerf. It just can't. It has to end with them. Albert Luna Sr., Patricia Luna, Rochelle Luna, and Damien Luna. Their names, that's the only real justice that lasts. That's the only part of this story that truly deserves to be remembered. So, 2 days ago, a clock stopped in Arizona, but the questions this story leaves behind, they're still ticking. How does simple anger fester and turn into absolute evil? And in our own search for justice, what does it mean when the final answer takes 30 years to show up?